first thing I noticed was the silence. Our lake is usually alive at sunrise, ripples from base near the reeds, herons stepping through the shallows. That morning it was flat, still. Wrong, then I saw them. Fish lined the shoreline in pale arcs, bellies up,
HOA
mouths
finally
open.
took care of that
Dozens
algae
at
problem.
first, then more as I walked the bank. The air carried a sharp chemical edge that didn't belong there. My neighbor Tom stood on his dock with a coffee mug and said, almost casually, HOA finally took care of that
The
algae
recharge
problem.
system
I
connects
didn't
the lake
answer right
directly
away.
to the shared
I was looking at
wells.
the aerators.
If
They
the
were
lake
off.
is compromised,
All three.
we all are.
They never shut down during treatment, and there was a faint, iridescent sheen spreading across the surface, catching the early light. That's when it clicked. This wasn't just a cosmetic cleanup. The same lake feeds our groundwater recharge wells.
I taught him everything I knew about the
A
lake.
single homeowner.
But the truth is,
We bought this house
the water we
12
rely
years
on,
ago, when the market
it's
was
not the
steady
same
and
anymore.
the kids were still young enough to think moving was an adventure. My wife fell in love with the back deck the first time she saw it. The water sat just beyond a line of oaks, catching the afternoon light like glass. She said it felt settled. Permanent before we signed anything. I read every page of the community disclosures. I work in project management. I don't skim contracts. The lake wasn't decorative. It was engineered, part of a managed stormwater and groundwater recharge system, feeding shared irrigation wells and supplementing residential filtration. It was all documented, neat and reassuring. My kids learned to cast from that shoreline. I taught my son how to clean a fish there. It wasn't just scenery. It was infrastructure tied directly to our home's value and, more importantly, our health. I've never had a problem with rules. Structure keeps communities functional. What I have a problem with is negligence dressed up as authority. So when I asked what chemicals were used, the room got quiet. Our HOA president liked to remind people she had spent 20 years in corporate management. She dressed the part. Structured blazers, measured tone, spreadsheets for everything. Her focus was always property values, curb appeal, comparables in nearby developments. Optics mattered. When I asked about the fish, she didn't hesitate. She called them an invasive population that was disrupting the lake's balance and lowering aesthetic value. The treatment, she said, was standard, professionally administered, fully under control. I asked for the product name, then the EPA registration number, then whether an environmental impact review had been filed, given the lake's connection to the recharge system. She leaned back slightly and said, "We hired professionals." It wasn't an answer. It was a dismissal. By the end of the exchange, she advised me not to spread panic in the community without understanding the facts. I told her I agreed about facts. What she didn't know was that I'd already pulled the county water management file. 3 days later, I received a formal compliance notice, taped to my front door. It cited harassment of board members and distribution of misinformation likely to cause community alarm. If I continued what they described as disruptive communication, fines could follow. I read it twice, then set it on the kitchen counter. I didn't respond emotionally. I responded methodically. Every email I had sent was archived. Every reply preserved with full headers and timestamps. I mailed a certified letter requesting documentation of the treatment authorization. I took screenshots of the HOA website, including the brief announcement about lake remediation that quietly disappeared within 48 hours. Neighbors started reaching out, quietly, not publicly. Text messages, short calls after dinner. They had seen the fish too. Some mentioned a metallic taste in their irrigation water. No one wanted to challenge the board directly. The conversation shifted. This wasn't about aesthetics anymore. It was about potential contamination. Then the contractor's invoice. Invoice arrived in response to my records request. I noticed something immediately. And something important was missing. The invoice was detailed in all the wrong ways. It listed the chemical compound, concentration levels, application zones, labor hours. It even itemized equipment rental. What it didn't list was a county environmental clearance permit number. For a private decorative pond, that might not matter. For a managed recharge lake tied to shared wells, it absolutely did. I called the county environmental office from my truck during lunch, kept my name out of it, and asked a narrow question. Had any filing been submitted for chemical treatment on our parcel number? There was a pause while the clerk searched. No, sir. Nothing on record. That was the moment it shifted. This wasn't just cosmetic overreach or bad optics. It was potential regulatory exposure, civil penalties at minimum, possibly personal liability for whoever authorized it. I sat at the kitchen table that evening and watched my grandson climb onto a chair to fill a glass from the tap. He grinned like it was a small victory. I had a choice: let it go and absorb the risk quietly, or escalate. I scheduled independent water testing and filed a formal records request. And that's when I found the email. The records arrived in a compressed digital folder late Friday afternoon. Meeting minutes, vendor bids, a few redacted attachments, routine on the surface. Buried in the chain was a thread labeled Lake Treatment Timing. The landscaping chair had written a cautious note. We should confirm whether this requires environmental review due to recharge linkage. I believe potable crossover is documented in the original site plan. The president replied 2 hours later, unlikely risk. Filing would delay treatment and inflate cost. We'll proceed under maintenance authority. There it was. Not ignorance, not oversight, a conscious decision to bypass review. I read it twice, then saved 3 copies to separate drives. They thought it was administrative shorthand. It wasn't. It was documented disregard of a known connection to shared water infrastructure. I didn't respond to the board. I didn't reference the email. I didn't hint at what I had. I didn't tell them what I had. Not yet. Instead, I forwarded the entire thread, along with the invoice and parcel documentation, to the County Environmental Compliance Office under my name. I requested a formal review of procedural adherence and chemical concentration thresholds for recharge-linked systems. The reply came 4 days later. An inspection had been scheduled. The board was not informed who initiated it. The HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I spent Sunday afternoon at my desk, not stewing, organizing. I printed the invoice, the county parcel map showing recharge linkage, the email thread, timestamps clearly visible. I highlighted specific phrases, not for drama, but for clarity. Facts speak better when they're easy to follow. 3 neighbors told me they'd attend, not to protest, just to listen. That was enough. Witnesses changed the tone of a room. I rehearsed what I would say while walking the perimeter of the lake. No accusations, no speeches, just questions tied to documents. Let the answers create their own weight. Through a community update email, the president hinted she'd present results of the successful lake beautification initiative, before and after photos, cost efficiency metrics. She was preparing a victory lap. I was preparing regulatory citations. She opened the meeting smiling. The meeting room at the clubhouse was nearly full. Folding chairs, bottled water on a side table, the low hum of polite conversation. The president stood at the front beside a projector screen, displaying a clean, bright image of the lake. After decisive action, she said, clicking to the next slide, the algae bloom has been eliminated, fish overpopulation addressed, property aesthetics restored. A few people clapped. It wasn't malicious. Most of them didn't know any better. When she opened the floor for questions, I stood. Can you clarify? I asked evenly. What environmental permit number was filed prior to chemical application, given the lake's documented recharge linkage to shared wells? She blinked once. The treatment was performed by licensed professionals. I understand, I said. I'm asking about county filing requirements under Water Management Code 14-72. Subsection C, the room quieted. Someone shifted a chair. She responded with something about maintenance authority and routine procedures. It sounded confident. It wasn't specific. I walked to the side table and handed out copies of the email thread. No commentary. Just paper. Residents began reading. I watched expressions change. Not outrage, just concentration. The landscaping chair's caution. The reply about delay and cost. The president's voice tightened. Internal emails can be taken out of context. Before I could respond, the back door opened. 2 county environmental compliance officers stepped inside, badges visible but demeanor calm. One asked, politely, for the board president by name. They explained there was an active compliance review regarding recent chemical treatment of a recharge-linked water body. You could feel the air shift. No one shouted. No one needed to. The officer requested documentation of filed permits and environmental impact review. The president said they would cooperate fully. Her tone had changed. It was smaller. I returned to the microphone. One final clarification, I said. When the board voted to authorize treatment, was the potable water linkage and potential filing requirement disclosed in full? There was a pause long enough to measure. One board member, a retired accountant, cleared his throat. I don't recall that being part of the discussion. Another shook his head slightly. The president started to respond, then stopped. Nothing dramatic happened after that. No gavel banging, no raised voices. Just documentation requested, statements noted, and a room full of homeowners realizing the situation was larger than algae. It was all on record now. The investigation took 6 weeks. The county's findings were clinical and precise failure to file required treatment notification. Chemical concentration exceeding recommended thresholds for recharge-linked systems. Formal warning issued, with language reference potential personal liability for authorizing parties if remediation proved necessary. There were no sirens, no lawsuits filed that day, just documentation with consequences attached. The HOA's insurer reviewed the report and declined coverage for any regulatory penalties tied to undisclosed environmental risk. That detail moved faster through the neighborhood than anything I had said. An emergency community meeting was scheduled. The president stood again at the front of the room, this time without slides. She described the situation as an overreaction, a bureaucratic technicality amplified by misinterpretation. She emphasized intent, good faith, volunteer service, but intent doesn't neutralize exposure. Homeowners understood that now. Health concerns were one piece. Property value and shared liability were another. No one wanted to finance someone else's procedural shortcut. When the motion for a vote of no confidence was raised, it wasn't loud. It was orderly. The count wasn't close. An interim board was appointed before the night ended. Someone nominated me for president. I declined. This was never about control, I said. It was about responsibility, and that was enough.